Okay. Thank you. So this talk is called Accelerating Your Robotics Startup with ROS. As Ryan did say, I've given a talk similar, not exactly the same talk. I've actually, it's a different audience here. I gave a similar talk about 2 weeks ago at RoboBusiness, where clearly they're very interested in the business side, maybe not so much in the ROS side. And so there were a bunch of slides in there to try and convince them that open source and ROS is awesome. I think you've been here long enough, we can skip those. The first time I sort of started on this topic was back at the ROS Industrial meeting in May as well. Sean Edwards had asked me to make a few comments about how we use ROS at Fetch, and so we'll also cover that. So basically the layout of this talk is we're going to sort of talk about what are some of the typical concerns that come up when you start to use open source in a commercial endeavor. And then we're going to address some of those concerns as we talk about continuous integration, and then open source versus sort of IP retention. And then sort of do a more in-depth aspect about how ROS is used at Fetch. And my last point on all of this is I'm not a lawyer, and so none of this is legal advice, and you should talk to your probably overpriced lawyers to get the real answer that they'll actually be on the hook for. So typical concerns, there's three, maybe a fourth that I'm not actually going to address, but the three that typically come up is sort of the technical debt that comes in from using this open source project, the system stability, because now you're dependent on something that's external, and of course IP. The fourth one, which I'm not actually going to cover at all, is security, and somebody did actually call me out on that at the RoboBusiness talk, so we'll put that right up front. Typical concerns, technical debt and system stability, I think are the two that really come to mind first for engineers. The business people will be much more concerned about the IP. Your investors will be much more concerned about the IP. But the technical debt and the stability is really important. And so continuous integration, which I'm a really big advocate of, is really important. And that basically is going to give you typically three things. So that's automated build, right? You're going to build everything in a clean environment. You're going to know that you have the right dependencies, because you might have something on your workstation, and when you try and roll it out into the field, you want it to work exactly the same way. You also want to run all of your tests, and you should be writing tests. And so automated tests, running all of those packages after each commit to make sure that things still work and that you're not getting regressions. Or that regressions aren't coming in from upstream, since you are dependent on external projects. And then automated deployment, which for ROS is basically the Debian packages or maybe Snappy in the future. So that's what automated continuous integration would involve. Obviously, I think I've already said here, you're dependent on external packages. It's really, really important there that if somebody changes something upstream, you catch it early. You don't want to catch it at a customer site. You want to catch it in-house during your in-house testing. This is absolutely key to success. If you're running a company, you don't have continuous integration, you're not actually running a company. Even if you're running a large project, throughout the weekend, we've heard a lot of people be, well, we had this, and then we had this problem, or something along those lines. There were a lot of, in the trenches stories where continuous integration might have actually helped quite a bit there. So it's just good practice. There was just a continuous integration discussion right over here during the Birds of a Feather. A couple things came up. There was a discussion of what is out there. One of the outcomes of that Birds of a Feather is that we're actually going to create a continuous integration page on the wiki that actually tells you where these different projects are. And there's basically two main flavors at this point. One is that the Open Source Robotics Foundation has their Jenkins build farm. There's the existing version that's running for ROS. There's a new version as well. And I have a Wi-Fi pop up here. Okay, and then there is Build.ROS, which I produced actually in Unbounded Robotics, and then we continue to use at Fetch. And so this is sort of that same graphic. It's actually straight out of my talk last year on continuous integration, and then the view with the waterfall. And so if you're more interested in continuous integration, that's all I'm actually going to say about that. Check out the talk that I did last year, which actually goes through all of those things in much more detail, because that's the whole talk. Even when you're using continuous integration, there's some other rules that you should really follow. Use the LTS releases. They're going to be around for a while. They should hopefully be a lot more stable. That goes for both Ubuntu and ROS. If it takes you 6 to 12 months to actually roll a new version out, well, Jade is going to be gone in like a year and a half because it's already 6 months old. And so those are two of the main, those items are basically addressing the first two issues. So the third issue that we had was sort of, IP, right? And so this talk actually comes out of a lot of discussions that I've had with people where they walk up and they go, oh, so you're using open source. So that means everything you do has to be, you have to give it all away. It's like, no, that's not true, okay? There are many licenses out there, and there are many licenses in ROS as well. There's a couple of common themes that basically come up in all of these licenses, and you should certainly, look into these if you're using open source at all, but especially if you're using it in a commercial endeavor, because then you're hopefully making money, and then somebody's going to sue you. So the common themes here are basically, the copyright holder. Who holds the copyright? What rights do they retain? There's also, particularly in the BSD license, can you use the name of that copyright holder without their permission? And usually the answer is no. A good license will cover binary versus source redistribution, which is where Creative Commons is actually pretty bad because they don't distinguish between the two. If you're creating, and this is for everybody, if you're creating open source software, please don't use a Creative Commons license. Use a real software license. A new theme that actually the Apache 2 is really one of the first licenses to cover this is sort of patent arbitration as well. A lot of earlier software licenses didn't discuss patents at all. Even though you might have the right to use the software, you may still be on the hook for patent infringement. And so the Open Source Initiative, or OSI, has a number of licenses that they are basically OSI approved. And these are probably the best licenses to use for software. They will all allow commercial use. Basically, all the OSI licenses say you can't restrict who can use it. Technically, you can use them for evil things, right? The license doesn't restrict what you can do with them. Not to say that commercial things are evil. I'm saying that you can use it for anything, commercial or evil or good or whatever. But you can't restrict the usage. What they do restrict is what rights you have at that point. So you create a new extension on that, and if you create some new code, many of those licenses will require that you sort of copy left, which means you give it all back, and that you have to release all of that code under the same license. This actually came out of a talk on Friday night with someone, since I'm frequently talking about things like this, as my lawyer versus license matrix. And so this comes out of, in a commercial endeavor, you're eventually going to be doing fundraising, potentially going public or being acquired. There's going to be many times in which you do due diligence. And that means a whole bunch of lawyers come in, take a look at everything you've done. And they're going to look at things like financials and who your people are and stuff like that. But they're especially going to be concerned if you're using ROS and you're using open source, they want to know that you've done everything right. And so this matrix basically is split into three categories of, your lawyers probably won't care much. They're going to look it over, but if you've got it all documented, you're good. If you're under one of these sort of licenses like the MIT or the BSD license, especially if you're more under the Apache 2, it at least addresses patent items on there. The lawyers are going to be very concerned if you're using something that's LGPL, right? So and you're extending it with your own IP, right? So LGPL basically allows you to link an application against it, and your application can stay under a different license. But if you have to actually modify the library, that's getting released back. And so LGPL doesn't generally scare them. The biggest thing is going to be, if you're like, well, there's this kinematics library, and we've come up with this amazing thing, and our entire business is based around this kinematics thing, they're going to be terrified, and it's going to cost a lot of money to review that. There's other lesser-known licenses like the Mozilla Public license, which can cause issues. This is a file-level license. It's actually applied on eigen, which is used throughout ROS. Most people probably aren't extending eigen, they're just using it, and so they're probably okay. But lawyers won't know about this typically. This license I found very few of them are actually familiar with, and so it's going to cost money because they're going to go look at that license in more detail. If you have like GPL or AGPL and you're extending it at all, they're going to be really, really concerned about that. And again, Creative Commons, especially the ones that have NC in it for non-commercial. So for instance, Gmapping is actually under a non-commercial license. And it's sort of the poster child, I think, for misused software licenses. So that sort of wraps up my discussion on those items. Sort of fetch robotics and ROS. So I think one of the important things when when we're going about things is that we're building products, we're not building middleware. That's not where the value is for selling to our end customers. It's a lot like the internet. Everybody's using Apache. It's what you build on top of it that is actually the business that you typically are building. So we use a lot of ROS components. Clearly we have to use things like ROS CPP, ROS Pi. We're big users of ActionLib, as anybody building a robot really should be. There's huge value propositions from tools like RViz and RQT and the various drivers. You can go out and buy a SICK laser and then go online and just download the drivers and get it working very quickly, and it's connected right into ROS. And then there's things that are kind of, I call them robot primitives, navigation and move it. These are sort of the beginnings of an application. They're not the whole thing, right? They're certainly not at a commercial level. And those are the ones I'm going to go into a little bit more detail with. To sort of give you an idea of, when you're going out and looking at ROS packages, I think we just even heard in the last talk here, there's a lot of things that are at very different levels. There's things that are very stable, there's things that are very much not. And so it's really important to look at those individual software packages and evaluate them. So we're going to take a look at two in particular here. One is ROS Navigation. And so the image up in the corner is basically straight off GitHub, and I think this is a couple months old now, but 59 stars and almost 200 forks. I'm sure we're probably over 200 at this point. So that's a really big community around that project. It runs on numerous platforms. Started on the PR2, it runs on all sorts of robots at ClearPath, at Fetch. Probably everybody in the room has interacted maybe with a Turtlebot along the way or something else. These all run navigation. Typically, getting it onto a new platform really only maybe requires tweaking parameters or possibly replacing the local planner if you don't have, say, a diff drive base or a holonomic base. It is plugin based. The CostMap 2D is all plugins for each of the layers. You can change them out. You can put new layers in for new sensors. David Liu has added something like the social layer in his PhD work, and so you can do all sorts of really interesting things with the nav stack. And it's based on the move base action, which is a very nice, simple action interface. So at Fetch, we were able to basically take navigation and it's not too difficult to get it up and running, right? You can sort of get an initial pass where, it navigates some of the time, and, maybe the robot gets lost every so often, but you can get a good first pass out of the box. It's good enough to make some demos and get that, get a company moving forward. We've done a lot of work of sort of improving the cost maps. I did a big overhaul on all of the mutexes to try and fix race conditions and times where it would hang. And we actually chose with that to release it back to the community. And so I'm going to sort of take a little bit of a segue here and sort of discuss, some of our thoughts on that area. I frequently am asked, well, what do you keep private? What do you release back? And we usually sort of sit down and take a look at it and say, well, how much effort would it be to keep this private? Because now we're going to maintain a fork. And so there's a lot of overhead involved in that. Is this really critical IP that's, a huge competitive advantage, or is it really just going to be more of a pain to sort of maintain our own fork? And for this particular one with the CostMap 2D, we decided, we were going to release those back. However, we then moved on to replacing both the local and global planners, and those are actually closed source plugins that we load into our commercial version of the navigation stack. And so that allows us to protect that IP, where we've done a lot of work extending something that's not actually an existing module out there, but building something new that connects to the existing system. Similar with MoveIt, so this is, I think, from MoveIt Core, which is the base module. There's a whole bunch of different repos in MoveIt, and so it's a little harder to get sort of just two numbers. But so MoveIt is a couple of years younger than navigation, so 25 and 80, but that's still a pretty vibrant community. And MoveIt connects a lot of other projects underneath it, like OMPL and FCL. OMPL being the open motion planning library, FCL being the flexible collision library. And so these libraries also have vibrant communities of their own. This, again, runs on numerous platforms. I think Dave this morning mentioned that it's like 65 or more robots at this point. It's definitely more, because if it was 65 there, I didn't see Fetch in his graphics. But it is, again, plugin based, okay? So you can do new planners, you can do new plan adapters, things like trajectory smoothing. And again, it's based on actions for move group and pick and place. How we've used it at Fetch. So basically, the initial configuration for MoveIt is actually a little bit easier. You saw the setup assistant. You can sort of get the thing running very quickly in simulation once you have a URDF and a model of your robot. And then you can start to move it onto the robot and tune it all in. And then we've also then gone and made some new plugins. So we have a new planner that we use and a new collision checker and a trajectory adapter. So we've replaced a large section of Move It, but we still get the tools like RViz visualization and things like that. We've also, because Move It's still heavily under development, we've built some of our own back-end, end-to-end integration tests that basically go through and build all sorts of plans so that we know when something new comes in that it's actually still all going to work nicely. And those are deployed on BuildBot ROS. And we also do a lot of staging of packages. Move It's a lot less stable than many of the other parts in ROS. And so staging and testing each time means that we don't roll out something that's broken. So across those two packages, which are both actually a whole bunch of ROS packages, that's about, I only discussed two things, but I actually discussed about 35 ROS packages, I think, right there. There's some common elements. Simple action-based interfaces. They allow easy external interaction, right? Plug-in-based interfaces are great for commercial development because you can change out an individual module as long as the license of the thing you're linking against is all good. The wizards and tutorials for setup on new platform are really great. So when you find packages where they have those tutorials and those wizards, you know somebody spent the time to get their documentation in order. Typically means that it's probably going to be higher quality code inside as well. Graphical debugging with RViz, if you don't have graphical debugging coming out of this program, it's probably not going to be very great to use. And I think documentation is absolutely important. And so this is somewhat redundant with that, but sort of evaluating ROS package and sort of just the one-page thing, right, is like, look at the license. Does it have documentation? When was it last updated? There's a lot of things in ROS that are old, like really old, like Groovy and Forte, and haven't been updated since. They're probably not going to work out of the box, and why did people abandon them? There may be something better that's come along. Instead of Robot Pose EKF, you should definitely be using robot localization, for instance. Is it released as a Debian package? That's an extra step for the developer. So if they've gone that extra mile, it's probably higher quality code again inside. Does it have tests? If not, definitely walk away. Does it have standard interfaces? If it uses the same interface as other similar packages that do the same thing, you could eventually, swap it out much easier in the end. Again, with like the Robot Pose EKF and Robot Localization, they have the same interfaces, which is really nice. And so lastly, a lot of this is tailored towards startups. Some of that information is valuable to other people as well. But my advice to startups is, going back to that due diligence aspect, keep track of all the open source. Keep a spreadsheet. All of my engineers at Fetch, when they bring a new package in, they have to go add it to the spreadsheet, right? And so it's what license, where did the source code come from? What version are you using? And keep track of all of that so that you know what you actually have there, and so that it's ready to go every time you need to hand it over to a legal team. Similarly, avoid any of those weird licenses. They're just going to cost you more in the end, so unless the package is really amazing, it's probably not worth the hassle. And use continuous integration from day zero. Definitely before we had continuous integration running at Fetch long before we actually even had robots running around. And so that's absolutely essential. And that's what I've got, so. What was that? I didn't quite get that. Oh, sorry, I skipped over that. Yes, so effectively, it does have patent arbitration in there, right? And so basically, by contributing to it, you are potentially also giving up patent rights that you hold, right? Once you've joined into that consortium and started to contribute code to it, patents that you have, you're basically binding yourself to arbitration on that as well. And so that's sort of the double side on that, is that lawyers may be concerned that, well, you're getting ready to contribute, or you have already contributed some piece of code here that is actually really critical IP to the company.
All right, any other questions? One back up there.
I'm not going to actually talk about that. I don't know enough about CLAs. Oh, the question was, yes, so the question was, what about contributor license agreements? I have recently heard, and I think the OSRF can probably give you more information on this, that with Apache 2, the Apache Foundation actually isn't doing CLAs. It's built into their license, and so they no longer feel that it's needed. But I think that's on a license by license basis, and definitely consult a lawyer.
All right, time for one more question.
Ian, I think.
Yeah.
So when you do find something wrong in your continuous integration with upstream ROS package, what's the standard procedure for fixing it? You go to the community with it, or you fix it internally?
So the question was, how do you handle upstream breakages? Do you fix it internally? Do you go to the community to fix it? I think it depends on, it's a case-by-case basis. It depends on what is broken. You know, if it's a recent regression, probably ticketing it against the upstream. If it's something where it wasn't designed for your use case, I think it depends on how that change, what that change really is. If it's valuable IP, you may fix it internally. If it's just sort of a trivial thing that something's wrong with it, you're probably going to open it against upstream.